Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. This week I'm joined by Matt Lewis, who is co-host of Gone Medieval podcast, has written a full biography on Richard III, and of course done several videos on history hits. And this week we are going to talk about the rise of the Plantagenets. And I want to begin because we discussed this right before the podcast. It's really, as we might will see, spoiler alert, it's kind of amazing how the Plantagenets actually managed to survive with the rather rocky start they had to their reign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're a phenomenally long-lived dynasty. So they manage, what did they get to, 332 years altogether. And they have some fairly atrocious kings during that time, some very good ones as well. And I guess they also are a great vehicle to talk about what do we think makes a good medieval king? What is the difference between a good one and a bad one? What are the qualities that make a king good? So yeah, there's lots of characters, lots of events that go on, and they appear at a really formative moment in English history. You know, it's really under their watch that the country that we recognise as England and some of the institutions of government really come to the fore and become as important as they remain throughout the rest of history. Really.
I want to begin before we go into the because I want to start at the white ship, but before we go there, because of course that's where it all began. But before we go there, I want to discuss the very name Plantagenet, and it's my understanding that it wasn't used until later in history. So and they were called the Angevin dynasty. But is it so? Is it really right to call the early Plantagenets the Plantagenets? Is that would be a later pseudonym for the dynasty? So is it should we go back to calling them the Angevin dynasty up until a certain point, or is it really right to call them the Plantagenets?
It's a slightly tricky one because the first written use of the name Plantagenet that we have doesn't come until 1460. So we're talking more than 300 years into the reign of this family of kings. It's used when Richard, Duke of York, stakes his claim to the throne during the Wars of the Roses against Henry VI, and he describes himself as Richard Plantagenet, and then charts his descent from Henry III. So it's clear that the name Plantagenet by that point meant something for him to have used it. It's clearly a name that people associate with that ruling royal family. But what we don't know is how much earlier that name has been in use or has had any kind of meaning. So the name Plantagenet is derived from Geoffrey of Anjou, who is the father of Henry II, the first Plantagenet king. And Geoffrey was famous for wearing a sprig of broom plant as a badge, sort of in his lapel. And the Latin for the sprig plant is the planta genista. And so that becomes corrupted into Plantagenet as a way to describe the family. They were Angevin, so being of Anjou means they are Angevin. So the Angevin kings, the Angevin Empire, and all of that kind of thing is a fitting way to describe it, but that is also directly connects them to their origins in Anjou rather than to England as king. So perhaps Plantagenet is a way for them to disconnect themselves a little bit from the continental holdings centered in Anjou in central France. And I guess particularly as they begin to lose all of those lands that Henry II brings with him, it becomes odd for them to take their name from lands and territories and titles that they don't actually hold anymore. And so at some point, we have to surmise that Plantagenet starts to enter circulation as a way to describe these people, albeit we don't have it written down until 1460.
Hmm. So let's start because, like I said in the beginning, this all began with the white ship, and let's talk about this is kind of this is really is the turning point, and is I think there is also what we'll do what have if the white ship never sunk, but let's not go there just yet. But let's talk about what the importance of the white ship and how this would bring the Plantagenets to the throne.
So this takes place in 1120. Henry I is King of England. He's been king for 20 years by this point. Henry I still holds the record for the most illegitimate children of a king of England or Britain. He had around 24, maybe more than that, illegitimate children.
He got around.
Sorry?
He got around.
He had lots of female friends in various places, I think. So lots of these children have different mothers as well. So he is clearly a very friendly chap who knows lots of women in lots of places. But he's quite good at recognising his illegitimate children. He does take care of them. Lots of them are provided with lands and titles. So Robert, Earl of Gloucester, will become particularly important during the years that follow. He's Henry's oldest illegitimate son. So he does take pretty good care of his illegitimate children as well. But Henry's real issue from a dynastic point of view is that he only has two legitimate children. He has a daughter named Matilda, who we remember in history as Empress Matilda. So she marries the Holy Roman Emperor, and although she's technically not entitled to call herself an empress, she isn't crowned by the Pope, which is the step that allows you to be called the Empress. She will cling to that title for the rest of her life and call herself Empress Matilda. His son then is William Adelin, and Adelin is a Normanisation of the old Anglo-Saxon term Etheling, which means something like prince or throne worthy. So it identifies him as an heir to the throne. And so in 1120, Henry I is in Normandy. His court are crossing back over the sea to England, and a ship's captain arrives and says to the king, "I've got this fantastic ship that's just been fitted out. It's brand new. It's the fastest ship you'll ever see. It's painted bright white. It's called the White Ship originally because it's white." And he says,
That makes sense.
My father, yeah. And he says, my father had the honour of carrying your father, William the Conqueror, across the sea in 1066 when he went to conquer England. And so I would be honoured if I could transport you, the current king, his son, across the sea now. And Henry I kind of says, thank you very much, but actually I'm sorted. All of my arrangements are made. But why don't you go and talk to my son, who's 17 at this point? Why don't him and his friends, I guess this is a little bit like getting the family Lamborghini out, let the young kids have fun in the posh new vehicle. So the captain approaches William Adelin, who is all excited for this. Him and his young friends begin to pile on board ship. There's dozens and dozens of them. They're all drinking, we're told. There are more and more barrels of wine being brought on board. They're plying the crew with wine as well, so everybody is getting drunk. There's a few people who get off the ship, most notably Stephen, Count of Boulogne, who will become important in the story a little bit later on. He gets off the ship because he thinks either he's ill or he thinks this is a really bad idea, but either way, it's an important moment that he steps off that ship. So then as darkness falls, Henry I's ship has already left to start crossing the channel. William Adelin, his drunk young friends and the drunk crew decide that they're going to try and race the king's ship back to England. They're going to try and beat him across the channel. So they sail out of harbour, and they don't even make it into the open sea before they smash into this huge outcrop of rock, which everybody knows is there. It's a well-known obstacle on the way out of the harbour. So the only real explanation is the drunkenness of the ship's crew and everybody else. They're not navigating the ship properly. Oh, sorry, my
don't worry.
My headphones just died. Just let me swap the speaker. Sorry.
Let me just pause the recording real quickly. There. We're back. Sorry about the little delay. So yeah, why don't we continue where we started off?
Yeah. So the White Ship strikes this rock on the way out of its harbour, which can only really be because the crew were drunk by this point. It was a well-known obstacle. They should have known to avoid it. But the ship sinks, losing almost all of the lives on board. And that includes Henry I's heir, William, and also several of Henry I's other illegitimate children, and lots of the younger nobility of England. So lots of noble families lose sons and daughters in this disaster.
But there is one survivor though in it.
Yeah, the only survivor is a butcher from Rouen named Berrow, who had got on board because he was trying to chase down a debt. So he was owed some money by the royal court, and he was willing to follow them all the way to England to get the money back. And it was the fact that he had poor man's clothes on, so he was wearing a big thick fleece from what we can tell, which probably helped him to float and helped him keep warm, whereas all of the nobility are wearing their thin silks. It's winter, so they get into the water and they freeze and they drown. And at this point as well, people didn't learn to swim. Swimming wasn't a sport or a hobby. It was something you might learn to do if you were a fisherman or a diver or something like that. But most of the population would never have learned to swim. So you've got people in ice cold water wearing flimsy clothing who don't know how to swim.
And there is quite a lot of shock as well when you come into ice water, right? So you don't, even if you knew how to swim and you were even drunk as well, and you had this shock of coming into ice water, you immediately don't think like, oh, I'm gonna try to swim ashore. That's maybe not the first thing. That it's a shock that hits you in ice water.
Yeah, I think it's that combination of things, because they're not that far out of harbour, and yet none of them are able to get back to shore. And as I say, it's only the butcher who manages to survive the night and is found in the morning, sort of floating amongst the wreckage, and no other bodies are found anywhere. So this creates a huge dynastic crisis for Henry I. His only legitimate son, the only man who could succeed him on the throne, has now died. And in fact, all of the other families in England who find out about this are mourning the loss of their own children and trying to disguise this from Henry, because no one wants to tell him that his only legitimate son has died. And in the end, we're told that they send a small boy to go and deliver this news to Henry in the hope that the king won't take it out on this small boy. And Henry is absolutely distraught. Once he gets over the initial shock and grief and everything else, he does look to remarry. So he's widowed by this point. He marries a younger new wife, but doesn't have any children with her at all. And so when it comes to thinking about who's going to succeed him, he's clearly very keen that it should be his bloodline, his children, that remain on the throne. But the only option he has now, illegitimate children can't be considered to be in line for the throne. The only option he has is his daughter, Empress Matilda.
If I may interrupt you for a second, that's interesting because, as we talked about a while ago, and in Mark Norris, we talked about how within the Conquest, the illegitimacy weren't necessarily that important because William was a bastard as well, and this is not too long ago. So it's interesting how legitimacy suddenly becomes a concern after William establishes himself.
I think the big differences for William the Conqueror are that illegitimacy isn't a bar to him becoming a duke or anything like that. Several of Henry I's illegitimate sons are earls in England. So it's not a bar to that kind of lower title, but it is viewed as a bar to becoming a king. The way that William does it is by conquest. So by killing the existing king and claiming the throne by conquest, which sort of deals a little bit with that problem of illegitimacy. But you will not find in the medieval period and afterwards, you will not find kings identifying illegitimate children as their heirs to the throne. So Henry's easy option might have been to use his oldest illegitimate son, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who is an incredibly capable man. He seems like an incredibly nice man. He would probably have made an ideal candidate for king, but clearly Henry doesn't view it as an option to put one of his illegitimate children in the line of succession. By the time we get to the 1120s, when this crisis is beginning to hit home, it's clear that being illegitimate is an absolute bar to potential succession. And so Henry is left with no choice but to look to his daughter, Empress Matilda, as heir to his throne. And the question of female succession is problematic. There's never been a Queen of England, a Queen Regnant of England by this point. No one is quite sure what it would mean or how it would work. But Henry causes all of the nobility to swear oaths to recognise Empress Matilda on his death as his successor. By the time that Henry does die in 1135, Matilda has 2 sons and she's pregnant with a 3rd son. It's possible then that Henry was thinking that actually it would be his grandson who might succeed him, his oldest grandson. If he lived long enough, then he could bypass the issue of female rule. But his grandson Henry is only a few years old when Henry I passes away. And so Matilda clearly believes that she is going to be Queen Regnant of England now. But she is also, just to complicate matters, she's pregnant. She's on the southern borders of Normandy, and she's engaged in a property dispute with her father over some castles at the time. So she struggles to move quickly to get to England. And in the space that she leaves, in that vacuum of power, her cousin, Stephen of the Count of Boulogne, the guy who we said got off the white ship, he's in Boulogne and he hops across the channel, gets to London, manages to get himself recognised as king and crowned. And before Empress Matilda knows what's happening, she's lost the throne altogether. There is a new king of England now. Once he's crowned, that can't be undone. He's now in place. And the question is, will Matilda accept this and allow Stephen to be king, or will she continue to press her claim? And the fact that she doesn't give up on the right that she believes she has to the throne is what will essentially lead us to England's first civil war, which is known as the Anarchy. Matilda arrives in England in 1139, so 4 years after her father has died, and she begins this military campaign against Stephen that will last for the rest of Stephen's reign until his death in 1154. And as we get towards the end of that reign, Matilda, in 1141, Matilda comes very, very close to having herself crowned as she will try and use the title Lady of the English. So Queen is a very specific title that means something very particular. It's the wife of a king, and she needs to be clear that she is not going to be a consort. She is not the wife of a king. She's going to rule. So she harks back to Anglo-Saxon England when we have Ethelfled, the Lady of Mercia, and she tries to use the title Lady of the English. But there is a backlash then against the idea of female rule again. Matilda is driven out of London on the eve of her coronation, and Stephen ends up getting returned to power, having been captured by Matilda earlier in the year. And then this sort of stalemate sets in. And Matilda seems to have realised that her being female was an absolute problem that she could not overcome. No one was going to accept her. So she then sets about maintaining the claim that exists in her family on behalf of her oldest son, Henry. So because he's the son of Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, who Matilda is married to, he is an Angevin. And when he becomes king, he will eventually be recognised as Stephen's adopted son and heir in a compromise to bring an end to the anarchy. And in 1154, when Stephen dies, Henry accedes to the throne as the heir to both Matilda and to Stephen. And that's when we get the beginning of this period of Angevin rule and the beginning of what will become known as the Plantagenet family in 1154.
And you kind of answered this question already, but let's just say Matilda has succeeded in gaining the throne. Would she have been accepted as ruler of England, or would she have been thrown out eventually? I know you kind of already answered this, but I wanted to ask a little bit more.
It's a really interesting question, and it's striking that she gets so close, and then it's almost at the last second everyone gets cold feet and thinks we just can't deal with the idea of a female ruler. We don't know how that's going to work. It's just too complicated and we can't do it. If Matilda had succeeded in becoming crowned, I think, England would have had to have learned to deal with that, but it would have begged all kinds of questions around who leads an army onto a battlefield, because traditionally that's the role of the king, the ruler of the kingdom. If Matilda isn't leading troops onto the battlefield because women didn't do that, then if her husband does it, if her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, does it, aren't they really king? What position do they hold? Because they're now performing the duties that traditionally belong to a king. There is also the issue that men clearly had a problem in this period, and quite often still do, I think, with the idea of bending the knee to a woman. It's a trope that we see in Game of Thrones an awful lot, the idea that men will not bend the knee to Daenerys Targaryen. They won't bend the knee to a woman. They don't understand how they can make themselves subservient to a woman. And that was a very real problem for Matilda. So if she had got herself crowned, she would still have faced a whole raft of problems that she would have had to work her way through. And I guess the question would be, could she negotiate those issues without causing such a backlash that she lost the throne again?
Let's begin with Henry's early reign, and I want to get into a certain woman very soon. But let's talk a little bit about Henry's reign before he meets this. I'm trying. Of course, I'm talking about Eleanor of Aquataine, and But before that, let's talk a little bit about Henry's rule before he gets the interest in this fair maiden, or maybe not maiden, but this fair woman.
Yeah, so Henry, I mean, they are married when he comes to the throne. So
Mm.
Eleanor is already there. And Henry becomes King of England with huge holdings on the continent. So he holds Aquitaine on behalf of his wife, Eleanor. And that's a vast area in the south of France. He holds Anjou and Maine just above Aquitaine as Count of Anjou. He's Duke of Normandy, so he holds all of that area in the north of Normandy. He claims overlordship of the Duchy of Brittany. He will say that Brittany is subservient to Normandy. So as Duke of Normandy, he's also in charge of Brittany. And then he becomes King of England too in 1154. And so he controls this vast area of land, probably more land than anybody else in Europe is ruling at this time. And he's incredibly good at it, actually. He develops a reputation for moving really quickly. So he will appear wherever there are problems. There are always little fires breaking out of rebellion and revolt all across his lands. And he will appear very quickly to deal with any of those issues. And he also develops a reputation for being able to break castles by siege faster than anybody else and faster than anybody thinks is possible, to the point where soon he will begin arriving at castles and they will give up because they know Henry has this reputation that they can't beat him. So it almost gets to the point where he doesn't anymore have to lay siege to castles because his reputation does all of the work for him as soon as he arrives. So he is incredibly successful at holding all of these lands together and subduing the rebellions that will necessarily crop up around such a vast area of land. And he's also a man who is deeply disinterested in the trappings of being king. So within a few years of his reign, the Norman kings were big on having these crown wearing ceremonies. So at Easter and Christmas and some other big feasts, they would ceremonially wear their crowns as a sort of another coronation moment for them. Henry does this at Worcester one Christmas a few years into his reign. And at the end of the ceremony, he takes the crown off his head, puts it on the altar at Worcester, and swears that he'll never wear a crown again for the rest of his life. And as far as we know, he never, ever again puts a crown on his head. He's famous for, I mean, Thomas Becket is obviously another name that crops up a lot.
I wanted this just a little bit of thank you for mentioning. But before we go into Thomas Becket, I'm sorry for interrupting you now, but I want to talk a little bit about the Empire of Henry II, because there is one historian who claims that it's clear it wasn't empire, it was more of a commonwealth in a sense. What do you think about this? Was it a commonwealth?
Yeah, so it's difficult to describe it as either an empire or a commonwealth, because in terms of a commonwealth, they were territories that didn't have anything particularly in common, and Henry didn't make efforts to force them to have things in common. And it's for a similar reason. It's hard to describe it as an empire, really, because you think of the Roman Empire. What do? They develop a Roman law code and military, and they spread that across all of the territories that they control. And Henry doesn't do that either. He allows all of the territories under his control to maintain their own law systems, their own customs, control of their own borders, their own militaries, and things like that, so that it's quite a light touch from the centre, I think. And perhaps that's part of the reason for his success, that he doesn't demand cultural changes in the places that he gains control of. He allows them a degree of independence and tradition that means it isn't too onerous to be part of this Angevin empire, for want of a better word.
Let's talk a little bit about the Thomas Becket incident and talk a little bit about the relations with him, because that's arguably, and I feel like Eleanor and Thomas Becket is arguably one of those that is overshadowed very much and it's kind of inevitable not to talk about them as well in an episode like this. So let's talk a little bit about the relations with Thomas Becket and Henry II as well before we go into the famous murder in the cathedral.
Yeah, so Thomas is a fascinating character. He comes from nowhere. He's from a merchant family who seem to be vaguely connected to some continental nobles. He spends bits of time in the households of a couple of noblemen and things like that, but he's by no means an important figure in England. But what he is incredibly competent at administration. He's clearly a very clever man who is good at his job. He comes to the notice of the Archbishop of Canterbury and begins working for him. And when Henry II becomes king in 1154, the Archbishop of Canterbury recommends Thomas to him as his chancellor. So the chancellor is the most senior official in the government, who might be the equivalent, I guess, of a prime minister, if you like, today. He effectively is the most senior figure in Henry's government, and he does a great job. And he's part of the solution to Henry's dislike for the trappings of kingship. So he will use Thomas to project his magnificence. Thomas is the one who throws big feasts and impresses people and hosts ambassadors. And there are accounts of Thomas holding sort of lavish feasts on Henry's behalf, and Henry will turn up halfway through the feast from hunting, ride his horse into the middle of the banqueting hall, hop off, jump over a table, sit down in his seat and put his dirty, muddy boots up on the table. And you can just imagine Thomas, head in his hand, thinking, I'm here trying to do all of this hard work for you, and you just roll up and make a mess everywhere. So they seem to have a good relationship. They clearly work together well. They complement each other. There are elements of their friendship that seem a little bit, there are elements of their relationship that seem a little bit like friendship. They may be friends, but Henry is also sometimes a little bit cruel to Thomas, which may be about keeping him in his place. So there are moments when he will drive home Thomas's humble beginnings, when he will, there's one time when he snatches a cloak off Thomas to give it to a beggar at the side of the road. So he does at points humiliate Thomas too. So their relationship, I think, is a difficult one to pick apart. And it really hits a crisis when Henry wants control of the English church. He believes the church is getting too much independent authority and Rome has too much influence in England. And when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, his solution to this problem is to make Thomas Archbishop of Canterbury, essentially so that Thomas can then hand over control of the church.
Isn't this where Thomas said, like, if you do this, our friendship will be ruined, and of course foreshadows his death?
Yeah, so Thomas, when Henry says to Thomas, great news, I'm going to make you Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas, his face drops and he says, I don't want this. I don't want to be Archbishop of Canterbury. At this point, Thomas is, I think he's in his 40s. He's unmarried. He's got no children. He's at the absolute pinnacle of government. He's an incredibly wealthy man. As Archbishop of Canterbury, yes, he's going to still be wealthy, but he's never going to be allowed to marry. He's never going to be allowed to have children. And also, if he's there to hand over control of the church to Henry, he's never actually going to have any power, because he's going to be installed there to give away all of the power of his office. So it would move him from the absolute top of the political establishment into a dead-end job in which he might be quite wealthy and he could be comfortable, but clearly that doesn't interest Thomas. And he pleads with Henry not to make him Archbishop of Canterbury. But Henry is absolutely adamant, I want you to be Archbishop, and then you can hand over control of the church to me. And
if I may interrupt you for a second, I don't remember which historian said this, but there is someone who seemed to believe that Thomas Becket from early on were not very sexually interested, that he was a virgin, even if he felt that he was a dead-end job, he was not very sexually interested. Is there truth to this? What is your take on this?
We don't know, to be perfectly honest. It's tricky because of the way that Thomas's life ends and the fact that he becomes a saint. All of these stories spring up around him having this saintly lifestyle from the very beginning. Can we reconcile a man who was utterly disinterested in any kind of carnal pursuits with the guy who was throwing parties and feasts and all of that kind of stuff? Maybe we can, because that was his job. But we don't really have evidence to tell us that he's not married and he doesn't have any children. which may lean into the idea that he wasn't interested in that kind of thing. But he may have been, focusing on his career. He may have meant to get married and have children a little bit later, when he'd achieved everything that he could achieve and he was rich and he was comfortable. And if that's what he wanted, then that was being ripped away from him by Henry forcing him to join the church.
So let's talk about his work as an archbishop and how this would lead into his eventual murder.
Yeah, so Henry thinks this is great. Thomas is now Archbishop of Canterbury. He introduces the constitutions of Clarendon and presents them to the church, essentially demanding that the church recognise Henry's authority over it, and denying the church's right to appeal to Rome in all sorts of cases. And you can imagine the scene as he looks at Thomas Becket, thinking, "This is it, Thomas. All you've got to do is say yes." And Thomas stands in this room full of people and says, "No, not having it." Henry flies into a rage. Thomas is eventually driven into exile. Henry tries to put him on trial. Thomas is warned that his life is in danger, and he flees onto the continent. Henry persecutes members of his family and drives them out of England too, because he's in such a rage at this point. And Thomas then ends up in exile on the continent for several years, making a real nuisance of himself. So the French king, who obviously has a problem with Henry, who is an incredibly powerful figure, is very happy to use Thomas against Henry. The Pope, to some extent, is indebted to the King of France. He's living in France at this point, and so Thomas is also able to make the case that he's protecting the rights of Rome. So the Pope and the King of France align themselves with Thomas Becket against Henry. So Henry is sort of backed into a corner by these incredibly powerful enemies, and Thomas will continue to make a nuisance of himself for several years, until eventually I think sympathy with Thomas Becket on the continent runs out. Even the Pope and the King of France decide they've had enough of this pushy guy who's never satisfied, who ruins any attempt at peace between the King of England and the King of France. And I think eventually even they've had enough of him, so they sort of concoct this idea that will allow Thomas to return to England and be reconciled to Henry. Thomas agrees. Henry, while he's in France celebrating Christmas, hears that Thomas has gone back over to Canterbury, and as soon as he's got there, Thomas has excommunicated all of Henry's supporters and is now in England saying that Henry is a terrible person. And that's when we get this outburst from Henry that's gone down in history as questionably, was it an instruction for people to go and murder Thomas Becket, or was it just Henry venting his rage that this man he'd raised up from nothing, put in this position of power, was defying him and not doing what he wanted? But 4 knights will leave that Christmas feast in France under the impression that the king wants Thomas Becket dealt with. They ride to Canterbury, they burst into Canterbury Cathedral. There is a struggle with Thomas, during which swords are drawn, and the knights begin to strike Thomas until eventually they slice the top of his scalp off, and he falls to the floor dead. And then we're told someone, as they leave the church, someone steps on his neck so that all of his brains spill out all over the floor. So there's brains and blood all over the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. And in the 12th century, this is an absolutely shocking moment. An archbishop has been murdered in his own cathedral, and the suspicion is that was done on the orders of the king. It puts Henry in a really, really...
This has some severe consequences for Henry, because he gets excommunicated by the Pope.
So the Pope is always quite careful they never really want to excommunicate a king. They will threaten it, but it's different to actually do it. So what Henry does, I think quite cleverly, what he does is he goes to Ireland, and he says to the Pope, what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the influence of Roman Christianity into Ireland, where Celtic Christianity still has hold. These people are, yes, they're Christians, but they're also barbarians. They're virtually pagans. What Henry's really doing is trying to extend his own political authority into the West, but he's able to package this up as almost a religious crusade on behalf of the papacy, and also remove himself from all of this controversy that's going on around Becket's death. So he succeeds. He sets up, the Roman Church in Ireland, along with securing lots of his own political authority and control over there, so that by the time he comes back to England, the Pope is actually quite grateful and initiates this investigation that essentially finds that Henry hadn't meant for Becket to be murdered and was therefore innocent of any crime. And so, at least officially, Henry is excused for any part in the murder of Thomas Becket. Although a few years later, when a rebellion is going on, it's striking that when Henry gets back to England, faced with this quite threatening rebellion, he rides to Canterbury and he goes and prays at Thomas Becket's tomb, and he allows the monks of Canterbury to whip him through the night as well. And we're told that it's during those prayers and that repentance that his enemies are all captured and the rebellion is thwarted and brought to an end. So then Henry gets to position this as being forgiven by St. Thomas himself. So God is back on Henry II's side. Everything is now dealt with. And so Henry seems to have this really good grasp on the PR of this disaster. He manages to make it work for himself.
And before we go into Henry's extended family, I want to talk a little bit about the relationship, which I think is important as well, between him and Eleanor of Aquataine, because it's kind of also important to his reign. And I want to talk a little bit about the age difference, because it was, and I mean, I think not we discussed this in our episode where we discussed on Napoleon, where we discussed Napoleon as well, because it was quite controversial then. And it still kind of is controversial to marry someone who's either older or 10 years younger to this day. So let's talk a little bit about the controversy between the age difference and how and the relation they had in general with, well, if this had an effect on their relationship, the age difference.
Yeah. So Henry, oh crikey, I have to try and remember now. Henry is something like 18 and Eleanor is about 28 when they marry. So there is this 10-year age gap between them. That in itself, I think, is not the biggest cause of controversy. Eleanor is someone for whom controversy seems to be drawn to her like a magnet. So before she marries Henry, she's been married to Louis VII, the King of France. They've been off on crusade together in the Holy Land, during which there were stories that she had an affair with her own uncle.
There's also a story that she had an affair with Saladin, which was impossible because it was like 10, 11 years at the time.
Yeah,
so
that's it. Yeah,
fair to be disputed as well.
Yeah, so there's the rumor that she had an affair with her uncle Raymond, the Prince of Antioch. There's a later story that she planned to run off with Saladin, who, as you say, was 10 years old at the time and wasn't in the Holy Land at that point. So it's all clearly just nonsense. But when they get back to France, it's clear that their relationship isn't good.
Again, if I may interrupt you for a second, the relationship with your uncle or niece, it wasn't entirely uncommon in the era, though, was it? So it is plausible in a way.
It's plausible. We can't say it's impossible. I think it's striking, if Louis believed his wife had had an affair with her own uncle, that he doesn't see that as a reason to end the marriage. They don't separate at that point. I think what happens in Antioch is that Raymond lays down a plan for the crusade that he believes will ensure that they win back all of the Holy Land and eventually Jerusalem. Louis VII isn't interested in that plan. He just wants to go to Jerusalem. I think Louis VII views this crusade as much more of a pilgrimage to get him to Jerusalem than a war, really. And Eleanor seems, according to the chroniclers, Eleanor seems to agree with her uncle Raymond and tries to get Louis to listen to her uncle and to change his plans, and Louis refuses. And for the kind of misogynistic chroniclers that we have around in the 12th century, the only explanation for a woman behaving this way and defying her husband is that she's clearly having sex with this man who she agrees with. They can't see another explanation for it. She's just a troublemaker. And so this rumor springs up that she's had an affair. I think if Louis knew Eleanor had been sleeping with her uncle Raymond, he would not have remained married to her for several years afterwards without kicking up a stink.
I also believe one of the basis for the divorce was that she only gave him daughters and not sons, which is always kind of, did you have the risk of being a woman in those age if you didn't give your king a son, that would mean that he should divorce or even maybe execute you, as Henry VIII later would in quite a few cases. So one of the reasons for the divorce is that they didn't she didn't give him any sons, but she later would of course give Henry quite a few sons.
Yeah, definitely. So they have two daughters, and I think the real political motivation for the ending of their marriage is that Louis needs a son quite desperately. So the fact that Eleanor is only giving him daughters, he and the nobles of France and the church in France position this as Eleanor's fault. It's her fault that she clearly can't have sons and is therefore not a fitting wife for the king of France. Of course, Louis's nose is then rubbed in it when Eleanor does have plenty of sons with Henry II, and it's pretty clear that Eleanor wasn't the problem in the relationship. So their marriage will essentially be annulled on the grounds that they are too closely related and should never have been allowed to get married. And then Eleanor tries to go back to Aquitaine, where she is Duchess in her own right. On her journey back there are two attempts to abduct her and forcibly marry her because she's now such a huge prize on the marriage market and she's available. Whoever marries her gains control of this huge duchy in France. And I think that drives home to her the fact that she's going to have to remarry. And what
And she
she
was
is able to
clearly
do.
beautiful too, and she wasn't that 28 isn't that old. I mean, I'm 29, and I'm not, it's I'm not saying by what the chroniclers say they were true, but they were singing songs and hymns to her and of her beauty and how there were verses, poetry about how so she must have been fairly fair as well.
Yeah, I think so. And coming from the south of France, where she did in the Aquitaine region, quite possibly had an element of almost the exotic about her. We France at this time, around Paris in the north, is quite a dreary, dry, serious place. The south of France is a much more lively culture, and so Eleanor may have seemed quite exotic to people in Paris and an unusual figure, if you like. So, and doubtless she got lots and lots of attention. She's considered to have been beautiful, but I think, when she gets back to Aquitaine and realizes she's going to have to remarry, the one thing that she can do is she can take a bit of control here. And if she thinks about, who could I marry who is going to be a rival and equal to Louis, because Louis has kept their two daughters in Paris, so she's had to leave her only two children behind. And Louis is also trying to get his hands on Aquitaine in right of their daughters. Now, Eleanor has managed to successfully make the case that Aquitaine is hers, but Louis is trying to get his mitts on it. So she's thinking, who could I marry who will be the equal of Louis, a rival to Louis, who could defend me and my territories? So although, Henry is very clearly a toy boy, he's 10 years younger, he has lots going for him. I think this is less about any kind of physical attraction than it is about Henry being the person, the only available person who she could marry, who could offer her the security that she really needed for Aquitaine. Because throughout Eleanor's life, I think Aquitaine, its future and its independence, are the real focus of all of her efforts, energy, and it's what drives her and concerns her for the whole of her life. So we know that she writes to Henry, who is preparing to invade England at this point. She writes to Henry and says, "Do you fancy getting married?" And, like a cartoon, he's there running faster than he possibly can with his legs spinning on the floor. And almost before he's opened the letter, he's at the church door saying, "Let's get married then." So he's clearly incredibly keen to marry Eleanor because he gets Aquitaine.
Mm.
Yes, he gets this 28-year-old, possibly beautiful woman as a wife, but he also gets Aquitaine, which is of massive importance to him. And this outrages Louis, the King of France, for several reasons. He wants
I mean, yeah,
Aquitaine.
again, I mean, sorry for interrupting. It clearly seems to have loved her as well at least in the early reign before it kind of deteriorates. So he clearly seems to care. I don't know how much in the later reign, the later relationship, but he clearly seemed to have feelings for her at least in the beginning of the relationship.
I think it's really tricky always to talk about medieval love because people always say kings and queens are beautiful people, wonderful people,
They were
and
not.
they talk about,
They
you
were
know,
not.
romance and all that kind of stuff. We can't say that Henry and Eleanor madly loved each other. I think what we can say is that they are an incredibly successful and effective couple in ruling a huge set of territory. So they clearly work very well together and they have a good relationship in that way. Whether there is love there or not, I think we would struggle to be certain about. It's possible, and it's possible that love grows throughout their relationship. But I think what we can say is they work together incredibly effectively.
Now, I want to talk, and sorry for jumping a little bit ahead, maybe perhaps, but let's talk a little bit about their children that they get. And it's my understanding that they do have children before Richard and John as well, that were supposed, but they pass away eventually. So in the end, the line goes to first Richard and of course John, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So, but let's begin with talking a little bit about the family relationship and their kids, because I would say it's dysfunctional at best. It's a very dysfunctional, maybe not have very happy family.
Yeah, I think it's one of those, if you read a historical fiction book where someone has this many problems with their children, you'd probably think this is just getting beyond belief now.
Mm.
But it's absolutely what happens to Henry. So Henry and Eleanor have a son as their first child very early on, who is named William, who doesn't live very long, unfortunately. But this, within a year of their marriage, sort of embarrasses Louis VII, who was blaming Eleanor for not being able to give him a son. They'll then go on to have, in the end, 4 sons and 4 daughters. They will make incredibly effective marriages for their daughters, several of whom their daughters and their granddaughters become queens
One of
and
them, the Henry the
duchesses.
Lion, most notably.
Yeah, so Henry the Lion, the Duke of Saxony, that will be an incredibly effective union again that will see one of Henry II's grandsons become Holy Roman Emperor, and will increase the network of power that they have. A couple of their daughters are married into other royal families in Spain and things like that. So they are reaching further and further and further in their networks of power. So their daughters are absolutely important. Another one is a Queen of Sicily. They are absolutely incredibly important, and they have very interesting stories of their own to tell. But I guess a lot of the focus is on their sons because they're the ones that cause their parents problems. So they will have the oldest surviving son is Henry, who is known as Henry the Young King to differentiate himself from his father. He's the only person in English history who will be crowned king during his father's lifetime, which is a French Capetian tradition that's supposed to secure the succession on the death of the father. But what it actually does is cause problems because Henry the Young King, once he's crowned, wants the power of a king from his father, and that's not what this arrangement was meant to be. But Henry the Young King struggles to get his head around this. The second son is Richard, who will later on become Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, and he is very early set up to be the next Duke of Aquitaine.
Hmm.
So it's quite often considered that he is Eleanor's favourite son. I'm not sure that it really is that he's her favourite as much as he's conceived in Aquitaine and he is created Duke of Aquitaine. So Eleanor's focus on the Duchy of Aquitaine and its future requires her to focus on Richard and his education and upbringing as its next Duke. The next son is Geoffrey, who eventually becomes Duke of Brittany. And there's one chronicler who describes him as the son of perdition, and he's seen as a bit of a troublemaker, one who stirs up his brothers to cause problems between the siblings and also to cause problems between the brothers and their father too. And then the youngest son by quite a way is John. So in the initial uprising, Henry, Richard, and Geoffrey all get involved in that. John is too young. You have to suspect from the way that John is later that he absolutely would have been up to it, his eyeballs in it if he was old enough. But at the time that it happens, he's still too young a child to be involved in that rebellion. And
I want to
essentially,
talk. Sorry for interrupting again. I want to talk about Richard as well because let's talk about his background because it feels like he was a mommy's boy, so because as I said, he grew up in Aquitaine and he well didn't speak English at all, and I believe French was a language in Aquitaine as well. So that's talking a little bit about his upbringing and how he would come to you mentioned the rebellion that would later be the rebellion against his father.
yeah, so Richard is a fascinating character. I'm not sure the idea that he was a mummy's boy is entirely fair. As I've said, I think Eleanor's focus on him is because he is going to be the next Duke of Aquitaine, and that's what really concerns her. I actually think Richard is a lot like his dad. He's a lot like Henry II in temperament and in ability. He is definitely the most competent of those brothers. He is militarily gifted. You know, he seems incredibly good at war. He's had to put down lots of revolts and rebellions in Aquitaine as he's being brought up there. So he has lots of experience of all of that kind of thing. I think Richard had the potential to be a very good king of England on a par with his father. I think the fact that he goes off on crusade so early in his reign and that he's captured on the way back kind of puts the kibosh on all of that, ruins the potential of his reign. But I think in terms of temperament and ability, he was actually an awful lot like his dad, and he got a lot of attention from his mom because of her concern for the future of Aquitaine.
I want to talk a little bit because some historians, because he does have a good friendship until it's ruined in when he humiliated the young King Philip King of France during the Crusade. But there is some, I believe earlier historians told him that he was a homosexual, but because he slept together with King Philip in the same bed. But as some historians have pointed out, it wasn't entirely uncommon for kings or people to do that at the time. So, what do you think about the sexuality of Richard? And I mean, do you think you believe he was attracted to men? We clearly didn't care much for his wife, that much we know, but is that a dispute for being a homosexual or gay, as we call it today? What is your take on this?
I don't know, and I don't know that we will ever know. To be fair, so the fact that he shared a bed, or is reported to share a bed with Philip on some occasions, is a way that kings showed favour to other men. So this is before Richard was king of England, and it was a way of demonstrating political closeness to someone rather than a sexual relationship with them. There are rumours too that Philip had a sexual relationship with Richard's brother Geoffrey. So I don't know how much of this is all stories that were designed to denigrate them at the time and to cast aspersions on them at the time. So Richard marries. Well, he's actually betrothed to marry Philip IV's sister Alice for most of his life, but the marriage never actually takes place. Henry II delays it for quite a while, and then Richard will eventually call it off when he's king, and he'll marry Berengaria of Navarre. But he marries Berengaria because Navarre offer him protection on the southern borders of his lands. They border Aquitaine, and so when he's going on crusade, he's thinking about how he can protect and shore up his lands. And so his marriage to Berengaria is really a political and military alliance rather than any idea of love. And yes, once they're married, it's his duty to try and produce an heir, and they clearly don't spend enough time together or don't produce an heir. Whether that's because, excuse me, whether that's because Richard is a homosexual who isn't interested in women, I don't know. Whether they just don't spend enough time together, whether Richard is too focused on the crusade and having children is a job for later. I don't know that we can ever know any of that for sure. And at any time we talk about the sexuality of medieval figures without express evidence, it's always going to be a bit of guesswork.
Let's talk about the rebellion of Richard because I want to talk about him as a king as well because I have a question I really want to ask you in a second. But let's talk about the rebellion and how poorly, or rather how how it was executed and why the rebellion happened.
Yeah, so Henry II's sons, particularly Henry the Young King, Geoffrey and Richard, spend several years rising up against their father in various arrangements. So sometimes it's Henry the Young King against his dad and against Geoffrey and Richard. Sometimes Geoffrey and Richard will join their brother to fight against their father. So we have all these different configurations of lots of ongoing rebellions. And Henry II is clearly struggling to find a way to get his sons to behave themselves. Henry the Young King eventually dies whilst in open rebellion against his father. Geoffrey will also be killed, we're told, during a tournament in France. He falls off his horse and is trampled to death by the horse. And this is where we get a story that Philip IV has Geoffrey buried in Paris and jumps down into the grave with Geoffrey and is crying tears because he's so upset that Geoffrey has been killed, which has been used to suggest that those two were involved in a romantic relationship. But again, we can't be sure. And then so Richard is kind of now the senior male, the heir to Henry II, but he still is rebelling against his father and pushing and pushing. And by 1189, Henry II is becoming increasingly ill. He's being pursued by Richard, who is in league with Philip IV of France by this point as well. So Henry II's sons successively fall under the spell of French kings who seek to drive a wedge between Henry II and his sons as a way to try and break up Angevin power on the continent. But ultimately, tragically, it will lead to the death of two of Henry's sons. And Richard will then, in 1189, literally chase his father across France. As Henry becomes more and more ill, Richard and Philip chase him across France until they corner him. He turns up for the last meeting that they have, so ill that he can barely stay on his horse. He's rocking from side to side as his servants are holding him upright in the saddle. And he eventually just agrees to everything that Richard is demanding. And he's told that he can't extract oaths of allegiance from anybody who is on Richard's side in this revolt. And so he agrees to do that. And when Henry asks for a list of people that he's not able to now extract an oath of allegiance from, the top of that list is his other remaining son, John. And this is positioned by lots of the chroniclers as the point at which Henry II just gives up on life and passes away. So Richard has literally driven his father into the grave and comes out of that situation as the new King of England, Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, Lord of all of those lands, but also someone whose sole interest at that point is to go to the Holy Land on crusade.
I want to talk about the famous last word Henry has. I don't remember them. I tried to look them up, but I can't remember them word for word. But let's talk about the famous last word that Henry says to Richard when this rebellion is done.
Yeah, so when they make that agreement, when Henry is forced to give in to Richard and give him everything he wants, we're told that the two share a kiss of peace. So, kiss each other on the cheek as a sign that they've reached an agreement and they're now at peace. And chronicles have recorded quite how they know quite how they know what someone whispered into somebody else's ear in a private moment. We have to guess at. But we're told by these chroniclers that when they go in for this kiss of peace, Henry whispers into his son's ear, "May God not permit me to die until I have had my vengeance upon you." So he's clearly unwillingly agreeing to all of this stuff. And even as his health is fading, he's almost swearing to get revenge on his son for the humiliation that he's inflicted on him. Henry will, pass away a few days after that incident. So clearly he does die before he's able to get his vengeance on his son. But we're then told that when Richard goes to visit his father's grave, his father's body at Fontevraud, where it's laid out on display, when Richard walks into the room, the corpse begins to bleed fresh blood, which is, in the medieval mind, was a sign that the deceased person's murderer was nearby. So this is clearly the chroniclers positioning Richard as the cause of Henry's death. He's considered to be his father's murderer at that
kind
point.
of a Philip II Alexander supposedly murdered him in a way to draw that comparison. And I want to ask you as well, because seems to be quite a bit debate and surrounding Richard. Was a good king or was he a terrible king? And in my mind, and I'm not sure you agree on this, but I would say he was not a very good king because he touches England to submission twice. He goes on the Holy Land and massacred the Muslims, the massacre of Acre, and he managed to get captured. So again, there goes the taxation again, and that bankrupts England. He clearly seemed to care more about the Holy Land than actually ruling the king, his own kingdom, and he would actually try to say famous supposed have said, I would say London before if I can find a buyer. So what do you, in my mind, all these things kind of tells me he wasn't a very good king, but there seems to be a bit debate here. So what are your thoughts on Richard's reign?
It's a complex picture. So I would say Richard was a bad king in the end. I think he had the potential to be a really good king because I think he shared a lot of qualities with his father. And he had a lot of the qualities that medieval people expected of their kings. He was tough. He was militarily capable. He was willing to be cruel when he felt it was necessary to deliver a political end. And quite often, those are the kinds of people that medieval people considered to be the right personalities for kings. That's what they expected of a king. The fact that he wants to go to the Holy Land would have been viewed by his subjects as an incredibly good thing. Yes, he extracts an awful lot of money. Famously, immediately after his coronation, it said that he puts every office in England up for sale to try and raise money to go off on crusade. But English people were concerned that Jerusalem had fallen out of Christian hands. They would not have been opposed to the idea of the King of England going on crusade to Jerusalem, especially to fight the Muslims. He definitely breaks some of the expected norms of warfare when he slaughters hostages and things like that. There are ways that you can try to rationalize what he does, but what he does is pretty terrible. But nevertheless, his subjects wanted the Holy Land to be returned to Christian ownership and authority. That meant war with the Muslims. So they would not necessarily have been opposed to what he did. Where it falls apart is the fact that Richard seems to fall out with every other leader of the crusade. From Philip IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, everybody doesn't like Richard, and that's partly because he's so successful. He
And it
marches
kind of
into
pisses off everyone else as well on the way that he is very doesn't really know he that kind of is unfriend humiliate a lot of people that he is on the way to crusade, so he kind of doesn't have a great relationship with any other ruler as well.
No, we know he goes to Sicily and effectively conquers Sicily, and then he has to go at Cyprus on his way there as well. And so he's very successful and effective in the things that he tries to do, but he's rubbing an awful lot of people up the wrong way while he's doing it. So when he starts to, I think if Richard had gone back from the Crusades and got back to England, he may well have gone on to become considered a very good king who would reign for a long time, been a strong and effective king, and may well have had a very different reputation. His issue is that he gets captured on the way back from the crusade in Germany, is sold to the Holy Roman Emperor, who then keeps him hostage for a long time, and it's the ransom that is demanded for his release that is the cause of these fresh rounds of exactions from England in particular, as they raise this ransom to get him freed again. By the time he's released, Philip IV by this point is working with John, with Richard's other remaining brother, to carve up his lands on the continent. Philip is using Richard's captivity to try and break up the Angevin Empire. John is trying to get his hands on England. So if Richard hadn't spent all of that time in captivity and that hadn't been allowed to take place, if he'd been there to keep a lid on John and to stop Philip breaking up his lands, he wouldn't have come back to kind of bankrupt country and destroyed inheritance that he does come back to. So it depends to what extent you think his captivity is his own fault for annoying so many people in the Holy Land. But if he'd made it home, I don't think any of those problems would have happened, and I don't even think we would necessarily have had King John, which, in many ways,
Maybe that would be a good thing.
well, in many ways, he's the worst legacy of Richard the First.
So I want to talk about John because it's my understanding that Henry did have plans for him somewhat, that he wanted him to rule these Irish domains, and clearly John didn't seem too interested in that. But let's talk a little bit about John and his upbringing and how, again, he would, again, as well as his brother would, form a rebellion, because that seemed to be the norm in the Angevin family, that they would say that they take on their favorite pastime. So let's start with a little bit of John's upbringing, what would lead to the rebellion against Richard.
Yeah, so John is the youngest child by quite some distance. His father's original plan, as he set out what he thought would happen to his lands after he died, part of that was that John would become Lord of Ireland, and potentially King of Ireland. So there is a story that the Pope had a crown with a peacock feather in it sent for John to use as King of Ireland. John goes over to Ireland and is typically, for John, very rude to people. There are reports that when he meets Irish lords, he pulls fistfuls of their beards out as a way to taunt them. So he doesn't make a very good impression when he goes over to Ireland, and behaves like a bit of a spoilt brat, I guess. So he doesn't win any friends in Ireland, and perhaps that's an early insight into John's personality as well, because that fits very well with the man that we know will later become King of England. As I mentioned before, he becomes wrapped up in this final rebellion of Richard against Henry II that causes Henry's death, and it's perhaps John's appearance at the top of that list of Richard's allies that really causes Henry II to give up. There has long been a sense that John was Henry's favourite in the same way that Richard was Eleanor's favourite. And just as I don't think it's that simple with Richard and Eleanor, I don't think it is with John and Henry either. I don't think it's a case of him being his favourite child. I think it's a case of him being the only one who hadn't rebelled at this point. So someone who was not tainted by all of that terrible bad behaviour, who Henry could focus some effort on, could give him Ireland, could make him, a powerful figure, only to then find out that ultimately in 1189 John had joined Richard's rebellion and all of Henry's sons had turned against him.
It's also my understanding that John wasn't really groomed to be king either, because they had so many heirs already that it wasn't significant. So it's no wonder that it was so incompetent, as we will talk about in a few minutes. But it's clear that he was not prepared properly to become, and it was never their plan that he was become King of England at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So the original plan had been Henry the Young King would become King of England, that Geoffrey would be Duke of Brittany and would owe allegiance to his brother Henry, as Henry would be Duke of Normandy as well. John would have Ireland, but that would be subservient to Henry II. And the other part of the plan was that Richard would get Aquitaine sort of separate from that. So this huge Angevin land was always going to be broken up, and Aquitaine was going to retain its independence, which I think is where we can see Eleanor's work in all of this too. Obviously, when Henry the Young King dies, that's all shifted around, and from then on in, it becomes a case of desperately trying to make a square peg fit in a round hole. No one is ever satisfied with what they want, because Richard now should be moving out to be King of England and in charge of all of those lands. There's talk about making John Duke of Aquitaine, but Richard won't give up Aquitaine because he's as attached to it as his mother was, because she's made him that way. She's brought him up that way. So he won't release his hold on Aquitaine when he should be moving into this other role as the heir to his father now. So all of this is quite fraught, and it means that John's position is never quite clear, but definitely he's never envisaged as being King of England. The intention was probably that he would be Lord of Ireland, subservient to his brother, the King of England, whichever brother that would be. And so his training would have reflected that he was going to have some political power and authority, but subservient to somebody else. He was never going to exercise that completely independently of anybody else. And that's perhaps reflected in his inability to be a good king when he comes to the throne. So when Richard is taken hostage, or when Richard goes on crusade, even before he's taken hostage, when Richard goes on crusade, John is originally expelled from England because Richard is clearly so suspicious of John that he won't allow him to be in the country. He clearly has the measure of John. Eventually, John does get back into England and seems to flip-flop between helping maintain Richard's authority and then desperately trying to set up his own as well. Once Richard is captured on the way back from crusade, John immediately leaps into an alliance with Philip IV of France because he sees an opportunity to grab everything that was Richard's. And what John doesn't seem to see is Philip's plan in all of this, which is for Philip to get an awful lot of Richard's continental territories too. And so John, I think, overreaches himself, doesn't have the ability to do what he's trying to do. And I think the biggest sign of that is that when Richard is released and comes back to England, he immediately forgives John and describes him as if he's a mischievous toddler, a badly behaved child. You know, he's not responsible for his own actions. He's too immature. And Richard really treats John like a little baby, which is probably, you know, how Richard viewed John after all of the trouble that he'd caused for Richard. But then when Richard dies, he dies without any children. He has no heir, no legitimate heir. And there is a succession crisis around that because there are two options for who will become king next. It could be John, who is now the last surviving brother of Richard I and the last surviving son of Henry II. The other option is Arthur, the Duke of Brittany, who is Geoffrey's son, who was born after Geoffrey had died. So there is a lot of question around who has the superior claim, a grandson through an older son or a younger son of the previous king. And it all gets quite complicated, but essentially it's settled by Eleanor, by John's mother, Eleanor of Aquataine, who wants John to be king. And that I think is partly because John is close to her, whereas Arthur has been brought up at the French court and is very close to Philip IV. And so it's felt that Arthur is beyond the control of Eleanor and any kind of English Angevin faction, whereas she, probably wrongly, felt like she could control John and make sure he was a good king. Obviously, she fails.
So let's talk about John's rule, and I want to talk about the relationship as well with John and Philip, because, like you said, Philip wanted to claim some of the Angevin land that is in today France. So let's talk about, and I want to specifically talk about as well this siege of Chateau de Lard, which is just ruined today, but was built by Richard as well, which was almost impregnable castle at the time, but John, of course, was not his brother, and he was not military competent. He runs away several times, and he at least run away, which kind of put the military commanders that they lose faith in him, and ergo they lose so much land, and the empire starts falling apart under John because Philip is so successful because of John's incompetence as a military leader. So let's talk a little bit about John's incompetence as a military commander before we go into his reign.
Yeah, I mean, John is utterly incompetent. He has some very early success. So when there is this rivalry between him and Arthur of Brittany, Arthur manages to besiege Eleanor of Aquitaine in a castle, and John manages to get an army down there really quickly and manages to rescue his grandmother. So that's kind of one military victory that we can chalk up to John. But aside from that, he seems to be pretty incompetent. He arranges alliances that never quite pay off for him, so he will lose a lot of the territory in France is taken by Philip IV before Richard dies, and John has contributed to that problem. But then once he becomes King of England, John needs to get that back again, and he struggles to do it. He builds alliances. He will lose the Battle of Bouvines, in which a northern portion of his army, which he's not with, lose a big battle, and essentially he will lose pretty much all of the territory on the continent that his father had held and that Richard had been fighting to regain. And to some extent, John is striking because he becomes the first king of England since the Norman conquest who is forced to live solely in England. He has nowhere else to go. And to some extent, England probably feels the intense weight of having a king who has nowhere else to look and nowhere else to get money from and nowhere else to focus his frustration and his energies and his efforts than on England. And to some extent, this lack of a big continental set of lands to occupy John probably really focus his terrible personality on England and make him an even worse figure than he might otherwise have been.
And this is kind of goes to haunt England for almost the rest of the early modern era, because it's time and time again there are kings, at least up until Charles I, to try to reconquer and reclaim their lost land of the Angevin Empire that they seem, and the closest successor, the one that's most successful to almost do this, is Henry V, but he of course loses all the territory when he dies during his siege of France. So this will come to haunt England, I feel like, almost until early modern era.
Yeah. Sorry, I missed that question.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I just have the losing of the Angevin Empire would come to haunt the England for the rest of the up until the early modern era, with all these kings becoming to try to reconquer the lost territory from
Yeah,
the early Angevin
there will be
past.
this lingering idea that England is entitled to those lands. So the Hundred Years' War, is not a dissimilar argument. Edward III will lay claim to the entire throne of France, but he will do so largely because of a dispute over Aquitaine, over the old inheritances of the English kings. And so the Hundred Years' War is, in some extent, driven by this connection between England and a set of continental properties. Henry III's reign, John's son Henry III will spend an awful lot of time trying to work out whether he can get these lands back or not, and it's clear that he can't. Henry III is not a gifted military leader, and he knows it, and so he kind of cedes control of all of those lands and recognizes that that's the end of the Angevin Empire. But Edward III will return to the idea of a continental presence for the King of England. Henry V will return to it again in the 15th century.
Charles
Henry
I
VIII,
as well.
yeah, Henry VIII will be obsessed with it in the 16th century. You say Charles in the 17th century. Charles I will rekindle that interest, and it's not until the 19th century, I think, that English kings will actually give up a claim to the title of the Kingdom of France and control of some territory in France. It's not until Mary I's reign in the 16th century that England will lose Calais and lose its final foothold on the continent. So there is this constant obsession with the kings of England for centuries after Henry II with regaining, rebuilding, reconquering the set of territories that he had held, which gives them a sense that perhaps they're entitled to them, or they should try and emulate their great forebear.
And we are going to talk about King John more in detail with Mark Morris very soon in July. But let's talk a little bit about John's reign. And I want to bring up some the thing here, which is perhaps most famous for in John's reign, which is the sheriffs. That the role of a sheriff in John's reign, and of course the famous type Robin Hood, which there were some, which ironic first as I understand was set in the reign of King Edward the First, not Edward the Confessor, but Edward the First, later grandson of King John. But it was later changed to King John. So let's talk about the sheriff's role and King John, and of course the famous legend that is Robin Hood as well.
Yeah, so Robin Hood is an interesting figure who is unlikely ever to really have existed, but is probably a composite figure of lots of romanticized outlaws who could live in these vast forest areas of England, and So I think he represents lots of people, and he represents a spirit rather than an actual individual. The earliest account of the legend of Robin Hood that we have is actually set in the reign of Edward II, um, and revolves around Edward II's problems with his cousin, the Earl of Lancaster. It then gets shifted into the reign of King John. So it's clear that Robin Hood is a story that fits in times of difficulty with weak kingship, with the breakdown of law and order and central control, and the idea that you can have an outlaw who has noble aims and means well and behaves in a way that you could recognize as noble, even if it's outside the law, because it's outside the law of a bad king. Sheriffs are incredibly important figures in medieval England. They are essentially the king's representative in a given shire. So the Sheriff of Nottingham will be the king's representative in Nottinghamshire. They are responsible to some extent for law and order in their territories. One of their main responsibilities is for taxation. So a sheriff will, if you're appointed Sheriff of Nottingham, you will agree with the king and the exchequer the amount of taxation that Nottingham will pay each year. You're then responsible for raising that amount of taxation and delivering it to the exchequer. The reason that sheriffs often become associated with corruption and being unpleasant figures is that part of the perks of a sheriff's job was any taxation above the agreed amount that you could raise, you could keep for yourself. So if I say I'm Sheriff of Nottingham and I'm going to deliver £5,000 in taxation to the exchequer, and I manage to extract £10,000, I still only have to give £5,000 to the exchequer, and I get to keep the rest of it for myself. So they could make themselves incredibly rich if they were good at their jobs. And obviously that's at the expense of the local people, who will then not have a very good view of the sheriff. So it's easy to see why they become associated with the ideas of corruption and being representatives of bad government, because they are the representative of a king in a region. And if that king is bad, by association, they will develop a bad reputation too.
Let's talk about, of course, it would be criminal of us not to mention the Magna Carta, but let's talk about John's reign for a brief moment. And I know we're going to round up soon, but let's talk about John's reign and what led up to the famous Magna Carta.
So John's reign would be one long problem, essentially. You know, he falls out with everybody. He seems to be able to make an enemy out of anybody. He falls out with the church in Rome. The Pope will place an interdict on England, which means that no church services can take place during that period. So this puts the souls of everybody in England at risk. But John doesn't overly care, because it also means that money that is raised by the church that should go to Rome no longer goes to Rome. John finds that he can collect that for himself. So actually John is getting incredibly rich out of the situation of England being under an interdict. He becomes the richest king in English history, I think. But by this point, he is raising about 4 times the amount of money that his father ever brought in to his exchequer. He's literally carting around barrelfuls of silver pennies, because there's no banknotes or, there's no banking system in England at this point. All money is silver coins, silver pennies. So John is literally filling treasure rooms with silver pennies and moving it around by the barrel load all over England. So he's not overly bothered about falling out with the church. He also treats his barons incredibly badly. John is an incredibly unpredictable, very erratic figure. So he can be your best friend one day, and the next day he's hunting you down and trying to have you killed. So nobody's quite sure where they stand with John. And for the barons, this is a real problem. What they want is certainty and political security, and they don't have that under John. And that's aside from the fact that lots of the sources say that John is going around sleeping with the barons' wives, sleeping with their daughters. So, he's generally treating them with a lot of disrespect. But there is also a lot of political uncertainty in the kingdom at the time. And this is what leads to the barons getting together and presenting John with a succession of documents that would eventually in 1215 become the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. And the real driving idea behind this is that it will place the king under the law of England. So at this point, the king is literally above the law. The king makes the law, enforces the law. The law is whatever the king says it is, and it doesn't really apply to John as king. Magna Carta's big change is that it will place the king beneath the law. So the law now applies to John and the king. John will sign it because he's under such immense pressure to do so, but he will immediately, by this point, he's reconciled with the Pope. He will immediately write to the Pope to have it overturned and rip it up and do away with it, which again ignites the rebellion of the barons. It's what's called the First Barons' War. And that will see John, marching around his kingdom in 1216, trying to put out these fires all over the place. Louis, the Prince Louis of France, the heir to the throne of France, is invited over to take John's throne from him. So there is a French invasion of England that is encouraged and takes place. The French have control of the south of England, control of London. It's lots of northern barons that are rebelling. So John, the area that John has power over, is being squeezed and squeezed and is smaller and smaller until in 1216, he's charging around his kingdom, falls ill, and eventually dies of what was probably dysentery. And ultimately, lots of people have commented, and it sounds a really horrible thing to say, that perhaps the best thing John ever did with his life was to die at the right time, because everybody's problem was really with John personally. So once John is gone, he's succeeded by his son as Henry III, but Henry III is only 9 years old. He's an innocent child who hasn't done anything wrong, hasn't upset anybody. And William Marshal, the famous knight, will immediately step up as protector, as regent for Henry III, and will re-grant Magna Carta as a way to take the sting out of all of this rebellion. And what that essentially does is unite the English barons again against those who are now viewed as French invaders, until eventually in 1217 we will get a battle in Lincoln and a naval battle in Sandwich, which will see Louis defeated and eventually driven out of England. And so John's death and the reissues of Magna Carta and this unification of the English polity again and the driving out of the French goes a long way in 1217 to creating the idea of Englishness and an English identity, which is separate from the identity connected to the French and the continental lands that had traditionally been shared by English and Norman barons.
Now, I have one last question to ask you, because the Magna Carta were on the news again recently. I'm sure you have gotten this, whether some environmentalists tried to break into the Magna Carta. What were your thoughts on this when you read the news about the Magna Carta recently?
I mean, I was shocked, and I guess that's the idea. If you're going to protest, you want to cause alarm and you want to get in the news and everything else. Ultimately, they tried to smash the case that Magna Carta is contained in. They didn't manage to break through the protective covering. I assume that is something reinforced and everything else. If they'd succeeded, I would have been absolutely disgusted that they would have been willing to cause that. As a historian, destroying 800-year-old manuscripts is
what does that have to do with the environment? No.
Yeah, clearly it's just to try and get attention. But if they'd succeeded in doing it, for me, one of the greatest cultural crimes in English history is Henry VIII's dissolution of the monastery, when libraries full of books and manuscripts were dispersed and destroyed all over the place.
We made an episode about that, by the way.
Yeah, well, go and check it out, because for me, that is such an act of cultural vandalism. It's unforgivable. And I think destroying something like Magna Carta, an original copy of Magna Carta, would have been getting close to that. Why you would destroy an 800-year-old precious document that has been protected, and we would hope to be around for another 800 years to center all of this important history around, for a cause that has nothing to do with history, is beyond me. I understand the motivation to get in the news. I think trying to assault things like Magna Carta is not the way to get your message across.
Thank you so much for coming. It's been a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. Before you go, where can people buy your book? You mentioned Henry III, and you wrote a book about it as well. So where can people find your book on Henry, and where can people find your podcast, John Medieval, or do you have any And social media, what's your Twitter/X handle, and you have anything else you wish to promote that you want to share below?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. So I have written several books about the Wars of the Roses, Richard III, the Princes in the Tower, but also about the anarchy, about Henry II, about Henry III. You can get those hopefully from any good bookstore. They're certainly available on places like Amazon and places like that. Gone Medieval, you can find wherever you get your podcasts from. So we cover all aspects of medieval history from the early period, Anglo-Saxons and Vikings, all the way to the Wars of the Roses and the beginning of the Tudor period. And we try to cover international history and all sorts of different aspects of everyday life too. I also host the Echoes of History podcast, which is another history hit one that we do with Ubisoft. So it's the podcast that accompanies the Assassin's Creed games. So you can find those wherever you get your podcasts from. Echoes of History is currently focused on feudal Japan, which I've been finding absolutely fascinating. And I am on Twitter at Matt Lewis Author, and I'll always call it Twitter. I can't call it X. I find it impossible.
Agree, yeah, agree.
I'm on Facebook as Matt Lewis Author too. I'm on Instagram as Matt Lewis History for reasons that elude. I don't know why they're not all the same, but it's Matt Lewis History on Instagram. So you can hopefully find me wherever you might be looking.
Thank you again so much for coming on. This has been Well That Aged Well. We are available on Twitter as well, and Well That Aged Well. You can find us on Instagram and Well That Aged Well. You can find us podcasts on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you are on Spotify, consider giving us 5 stars. You can give us one. It's a free country, this part of the world, so do whatever you like. And if you are on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. That would be very nice. And we are going to run it up now. Thank you for coming on the podcast again. It's been a great pleasure. My name is Alan. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.